Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of ML in a Minute. I'm Terry, co-founder of Remix AI, and your host. And this week we have a special guest joining us, Jason AI. If you haven't heard of Jason AI, then check out the podcast This Week in Startups, hosted by Jason Calacanis. Eventually you'll hear him mention the challenge to the audience to create a LLM that emulates his voice in a realistic way. They're thinking about ways that they can expand their reach as media, and we've heard this challenge issued a few times. And if you go try to do something like this just using ChatGPT, you might find yourself disappointed. I'm looking here at the screen where I've prompted the GPT-4 to act or emulate the voice of Jason Calacanis and respond to a practical question. And at first it looks like good advice, but if you've tried this a couple of times, you start to see the response is a bit formulaic. It looks like it's summarizing Wikipedia articles, and that's not really in the voice of Jason Calacanis. So if you listen to his podcast, it's much more conversational, straightforward. It's not going to be a wall of text for you, but it's going to be more chopping it up with you. And so we thought that by retrieving a bunch of the podcast samples, we might be able to use the transcripts to train an LLM. But unfortunately, we couldn't find the transcripts already labeled and annotated for us. What we could find is an API where we could retrieve hundreds of these podcasts. And so we pulled out these MP3s down, and we turned to speech to text to try to extract more structured information that we could use to train our LLM. We're going with the Llama 2 checkpoint using parameter efficient fine tuning. And to get the annotated data, we used WhisperX. So in this way, we could perform speech to text on all the MP3 files and get subrit.srt files that would annotate the speech that's being spoken. But we wanted to also use speaker diarization, which you see they feature in this WhisperX GitHub repo, and that allows you to attribute to different speakers the words that have been transcribed. It doesn't tell you exactly who said it, though. It's labeled at the level of speaker 1, speaker 2, and so you need to find a way to attribute that speaker 1 is Jason, for example. And so for that, we sampled excerpts from the transcript, and we sent it to ChatGPT and prompted ChatGPT to reason over the excerpts to help us guess who the host of the podcast was and who the guest was. And in this way, we could annotate the transcripts so that we knew which speaker was Jason for most of the samples that we had collected out of hundreds of MP3s and thousands of conversational turns. Then eventually we could build up a data set where the guest is issuing a statement and the response is by Jason. And by training in this way, we could optimize our model to emulate the response of Jason based off of real conversations. And so given any guest's prompt as input, we wanted our model to be really good at producing a text stream output that was as close as possible to the voice of Jason Calacanis as we know it from the podcast. And so after we built up this data set, we were able to use parameter efficient fine tuning on Llama 2 with a 7B checkpoint. And after a couple of days of training that, we were starting to find responses that look quite realistic. And so I'm just going to cut to the video where we can watch that now.
How do you take the idea and then start to test its viability, and which framework should I use for testing it? Now, some people will just go and build something and see that it works or fails in the market, but this allows you to do some higher level analysis before you get into the build phase, and maybe, before you spend your money or energy on building something.
And this is, as we've discussed with generative AI, you may not want to make a healthcare decision on it right now or a finance decision. Obviously, they can hallucinate. But when you think about just ideation, coming up with ideas, fancy word for coming up with ideas and developing them, brainstorming, another word for that, chewing the fat, jam session. This is just giving you so many jumping off points. So
we saw a response which was biased towards taking action and trying your product out in the market, moving fast. I think that's something that would jive with Jason. And after that, we saw what Jason actually said in that exchange. And so you can imagine being able to interact with an agent that's conditioned to respond in a way Jason would, and what that might allow for you when you're planning to learn more about startup, whether there's a question that you really want Jason's take on, or whether you want to understand like how he thinks about a topic. So going beyond this, we'd like to get more samples to train on. There's hundreds more excerpts that we haven't trained on. Likely working with the creators, we could get much more data to train on. We can train for longer, and we can do a more exhaustive hyperparameter optimization to really get this model looking good. Beyond that, we can take a bunch of data, a bunch of knowledge base that Jason would recommend, and index it so that we can use retrieval augmented generation to ground our model's response and factual data that he might cite in a response. If you found this interesting, do subscribe or follow our newsletter at Remix AI. Thanks for joining. Till next time.